Hey, everybody. So, the first time someone asked me if I'd heard of Spotify, I thought it was a band. So I did one of these like, well, I think I've heard some of their stuff. It sounds familiar, right? And they're like, no, that's not what it is, right? So I identify as a Zennial, which means I had mostly an analog childhood, but I'm a little older than the Gen Xers, so I transitioned to a digital adulthood a little quicker. So I'm down with the technology trends. I'm just a little slow to get there, right? So when I finally figured it out, I downloaded Spotify. This was about 5 years ago. So I was in graduate school working on my doctorate in English education at Arizona State University. And what everybody was talking about as I upgraded from iTunes and even CDs was everybody was talking about Kendrick Lamar, who had just won the Pulitzer Prize for music for his album Damn. So I thought, as an English teacher, the Pulitzer Prize, this carries a lot of literary significance. This is something I need to explore and check out. So that was the first thing that I listened to on Spotify was Kendrick Lamar's Damn album. So I'm walking across Arizona State's campus. It's a big campus, sunny day. And his intro track, if you're familiar with this album, is called Blood. And in this narrative track, Kendrick Lamar talks about walking around his neighborhood and he encounters this woman who appears to be blind. She seems to have dropped something, so he goes to help her. And when he goes to help her, she stands up and shoots him dead. Then it goes into a little bit of a soundbite of some news commentators discussing Kendrick Lamar's takes on police violence, his stance on policing, and saying that they don't like it. And then it launches into his first rap track, which is called DNA. So I'm thinking about this as I'm walking across campus. There's got to be some significance to it, right? This is the opening to a Pulitzer Prize winning album. What's the significance? What's he trying to say with the story of this blind woman who shot him dead? And as I'm walking across campus, it dawns on me. He's talking about the blind lady of justice. You know, this statue that we see outside of courtrooms and to symbolize justice with the blindfold, being blind to biases, with the sword, or in this case, a gun, to administer punishment in the case of guilt, and the scales to weigh the evidence in terms of guilt or innocence. So in this case, which did she drop? Right? So this was revolutionary to me because I was on my way to teach an English education methods course. So future pre-service English teachers, future English teachers. And we were reading a book called All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Keeley. This award-winning YA book is really unique because it's a dual perspective narrative featuring a white protagonist and a black protagonist, written by a white author and a black author together around multiple perspectives around an incident of racial profiling and racial violence. So I thought, wow, this provoking song, the beginning of Kendrick Lamar's album, what a great match to this song. So I brought it into class and we listened to it and we discussed this image of Lady Justice. So I started developing this text set, which had media, it had a book, it had images, it had music. I had also just listened to watched Ava DuVernay's The 13th Amendment, the Oscar-winning documentary about racial inequities in the prison system. Jay-Z, the rapper, had just put out a video op-ed called The War on Drugs is an Epic Fail for the New York Times, which was revolutionary because it was a video op-ed, so it included animation and, of course, Jay-Z's iconic voice, but it was also an opinion piece. So it was a video op-ed called The War on Drugs is an Epic Fail. All of these texts together were brought into this really interesting text set to teach a broader theme around the book. So the learning grew beyond just this one novel to include books and films and all different types of text from all different types of mediums and genres. This is part of what I mean when I say we need to rethink the way we read. So one of the premises that I start my children's and young adult literature courses with is that all texts are limited. By texts being limited, I don't mean that they're bad. I just mean that all books can't be all things to all readers. Some readers prefer fiction to nonfiction. Some readers prefer to listen to spoken word poetry and performance poetry. Some folks don't like to read at all. They prefer cinema or they prefer music, right? And in reality, most of us are probably taking the things that we read and listen to and watch and kind of putting them into a conversation in our head. Right? So by limited, I mean that individual text can be limited by all sorts of things, by genre, by medium, by representation, by age of the text. And by putting them into conversation together, we create more powerful learning that's based on theme and lesson. So by rethinking the way we read, what I mean is this notion of what we tell future educators that we call text pairing, or building text sets, building text circles, what Dr. Goldie Mohammed calls text layering, right? And this is an essential skill for educators, and it's probably something that you all do automatically as well, is when you watch something new or read something new, you're automatically comparing it and connecting it to other things you've watched, read, and listened to. One example for me, I'm a big fan of narrative nonfiction. So to steal the tagline from Creative Nonfiction magazine, that's true stories well told. So memoirs, literary journalism, in films, we're talking documentaries, any true story that has a narrative element to it, that's what I enjoy. So as I was thinking about ways to bring this underrepresented genre into the classroom when I was still teaching high school, I stumbled upon a pattern that I noticed, which is that oftentimes based on a true story films, those big budget Hollywood stories that have that tagline based on a true story, oftentimes those are adaptations of a narrative nonfiction book, a full-length book work of literary journalism. Sometimes those books actually came out of articles, feature-length articles from magazines. So this creates a pattern I call the narrative nonfiction spiral. An article, a feature-length article from a magazine spirals into a full-length book, which then gets adapted into a based on a true story Hollywood film. What's interesting about this instructionally is that each one of these can be gateways for us as readers or viewers. You might watch the movie, which then leads you to go back and read the book. Or maybe you read the article and then you see there's a book and you go that way, you follow it through that way. And then in between the adaptations, as one text spirals into the next, there's supporting nonfiction in the form of reviews. Like the book comes out and there's book reviews. So you might read a review and say, I have to read this book, right? Or when the film comes out, there's interviews with the cast if they read the book. There's interviews with the author. What did he think of the adaptation? And those ancillary pieces might bring us into the text set as well. So what's interesting is it becomes more about the story and the themes and the lessons, and each text builds upon one another to create something that's bigger than any individual text. So one example of this, you might be familiar with the writer Michael Lewis. If that doesn't ring a bell, maybe you've seen the film The Blind Side, the football movie with Sandra Bullock. That is based on a book written by Michael Lewis, which actually started as a long-form piece of journalism in the New York Times Sunday magazine. He did it again with Moneyball, which was the baseball movie with Brad Pitt. That was also a book which started as a piece of journalism, Michael Lewis. And if you're a finance person, business and finance, The Big Short, which was a Hollywood film, book, that was Michael Lewis as well. So he's a good example of that pattern. So I think you can see the value here through this example of thinking beyond a single text. I want to challenge this notion of saying we need to read this book or not read this book or read this list of books or not read this list of books, because the conversation is always bigger than a single text. But as powerful as this notion of building text networks, text circles, text layerings is, it comes with a caution. So one of the biggest limitations that a single text can have is in representation. Who's in the book, and probably more importantly, who's not in the book, right? So this is what Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop calls the mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors principle. The mirror character is when we see ourselves in the characters that we read and we see and we hear, the ones that reflect back our identity markers. And mirrors are valuable because they validate us. Right? So we gravitate toward mirrors. It makes us feel validated. But then there's the window text, which is this idea that a movie or a book, this should be a safe space by which we can glimpse the lives of others, glimpse into the experience of someone who has identity markers different than us. That's the window text, right? So when I taught 8th grade for 9 years, one of our standard books is probably one that some of you are familiar with, To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird, published in 1960, won that Pulitzer Prize, which Kendrick Lamar is also a laureate of now. And it's been taught ever since. In the 70 plus years since, it's still a New York Times bestseller, still kind of held up as this book championing racial justice, even though it mostly centers white characters. I taught this without question for 9 years, and I started building this type of text network around it in my instruction. I brought in some film clips. I brought in a song. So for example, you might recognize some of these texts. There's a Western called High Noon where a sheriff stands up against the situational influences of his town, single-handedly taking on the evil. Or maybe you've seen a play or one of the film versions of 12 Angry Men where a juror single-handedly turns the rest of the jury in a case that was being decided a little bit too quickly. And I thought these characters are a lot like Atticus Finch, right? They're these unconventional heroes standing banning against situational influences. Then I'm a fan of music, right? So I thought of Tom Petty in this song, I Won't Back Down. It's like, well, that would make a great theme song for these characters. And to bring in a bit of nonfiction, I brought in clips from the biopic, Oscar-winning biopic, Gandhi, to show how Gandhi was portrayed to have resisted some of the situational influences in his situation. But here's the rub. Upon critical reflection, I recognized not only did all these characters look like Atticus, they also look like me. This was my mirror. I had assembled unconsciously a collection of mirror texts that all reflected my identity and what made sense in terms of a hero for me. And what a missed opportunity this was, because when I started teaching back in 2003, there was this incredible independent film which I loved called Whale Rider. Whale Rider was adapted from a young adult novel by the same name written by a Maori writer. The film featured a mostly indigenous cast, and it centered around a youth female protagonist who, not unlike Scout Finch, who stood against the situational patriarchal values of her culture, not unlike Atticus Finch. And this would have been a great addition to that text set and a great window text. And I failed to recognize that at the time, only recognize it now upon critical reflection. So, in rethinking the way we read, the first step is in building these textual networks, thinking beyond a single text and bringing in the things we watch, the things we listen to, multiple texts in conversation. That's step one. But we also need to unpack our personal biases. Are we reading the window? Are we watching the window as well as the mirror? An individual's right to read is a sacred and valuable freedom, but with that comes a responsibility. Are we reading that window as well as the mirror? This personal responsibility is also something that's societal. I'm sure some of you have seen on the news. We're seeing more and more that there are book bans all across the country by state legislatures, local school boards. Oftentimes that argument is because of one controversial passage. So if you know that old saying, throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a controversial passage, throw out the book. More troubling is when there's a controversial book and then that leads to a list of books that are thrown out of a library. Controversial book, throughout the library, right? So this argument about a single book leads to these big book bans. So societally, we have to question the reasons behind that as well. Are we reading the window as well as the mirror? This responsibility is even bigger if, like me, you're in the position of providing books to children. It shouldn't be about banning choices. It should be about expanding choices. Then honestly reflecting on individual and societal bias and bringing those books and texts into conversation with those reflections and into conversation with those connections. Those are the keys to rethinking how we read. Thank you.